Welcome to this explainer on the Han Dynasty. We're zooming in on a massive golden age, stretching from roughly 202 BCE to 220 CE. Now, this is the era that effectively created the very blueprint for imperial China. It set up the bureaucratic systems, the cultural norms, and the profound philosophical foundations that would last for over 2 millennia. But, as we're going to see today, the blueprint wasn't exactly how the house was built.
See, officially, Han laws and state-sponsored scholars imagined a world of total, strict order, complete cosmic harmony, and rigid class systems. Everything had its perfect place. But the everyday reality on the ground? Well, it was a whole lot messier, and honestly a whole lot more fascinating. The rules on paper said one thing, but human nature and raw economics usually dictated another. All right, let's look at the roadmap for today. We are unpacking 5 key areas. First, the imperial social ladder. Second, wealth versus social status. Third, family, marriage, and gender. Fourth, philosophy, law, and education. And finally, religion, cosmology, and rebellion. Jumping right into part 1, the imperial social ladder. We've got to start at the absolute top with the emperor. This was a figure so incredibly elevated that his subjects couldn't even say his name out loud. They literally had to refer to him as under the steps to the throne. Beneath him was this vast, supposedly perfectly ordered hierarchy of royals, nobles, officials, and commoners. But to find our first real surprise, let's look all the way down at the very bottom of that ladder. When we think about massive ancient empires like the Greco-Roman world operating right around the same time, we usually picture huge slave populations forming the absolute bedrock of the economy. But Han China? It was incredibly different. Get this. Enslaved people made up roughly 1% of the entire population. Just 1%. It's wild, right? So instead of relying on slave labor, the ultra-wealthy and powerful actually relied mostly on poor, free tenant farmers. These were landless peasants who would work the massive estates of the rich, and they'd have to hand over roughly half of everything they produced just to cover rent. So yeah, while they were technically free, their day-to-day economic reality was often incredibly harsh.
Which brings us to part 2, wealth versus social status.
And here is our first massive paradox. The huge gap between your official social rank and, well, what was actually sitting in your bank account. According to the state's Confucian scholars, the independent farmer was the absolute backbone of society. They grew the food, they paid the taxes, they were deeply revered. Merchants, on the other hand, the law absolutely despised them. They were seen as parasites who just traded what other people made. The law actually forced registered merchants to wear white clothes just to flag their low status, and they were completely banned from riding horses or holding office. But the reality? Countless revered farmers fell into crushing debt and lost their farms entirely, while those legally oppressed merchants built vast, super lucrative networks. They often ignored those clothing laws completely and lived like absolute kings. Now, to try and keep everyone in their proper place, the government maintained a really strict 20-rank system for commoners and nobles. You could actually get promoted in rank for doing good deeds, or honestly just for living to an old age. And these ranks came with legal perks and an official salary paid out in bushels of grain. A rank 1 gentleman received 50 bushels, while a top-tier rank 20 full marquis got 1,000 bushels. On paper, it looks like this perfect, orderly system of state reward. But here's where reality completely shatters the blueprint. A single so-called great merchant, someone moving heavy volume in salts, iron, or money lending, could easily own properties worth 10 million cash coins. 10 million. Some merchant families literally made fortunes of over 100 million. They completely dwarfed the lifetime earnings of those top-ranking, highly respected government officials we just talked about. The state handed out the fancy titles, sure, but the merchants? They held the actual cash. All right, moving on to section 3, family, marriage, and gender. Inside the domestic sphere, the Han idealized this very strict, nuclear, patrilineal family structure. Custom and law dictated highly specific, submissive roles for women, while the father was the supreme head of the household. Just listen to this quote from the famous female Han historian Bon Cao, because it really captures the official standard of the era. A woman's entire life was defined by the 3 submissions. She was expected to yield first to her father, then, after an arranged marriage, to her husband, and finally, in her old age, to her adult son. And the legal system definitely backed men up on this dynamic. Husbands actually had 7 legally codified reasons they could use to divorce their wives. Some are kind of what you'd expect for the ancient world, like adultery or barrenness, since producing an heir was the top priority. But get this, one of the actual completely legal justifications for divorce was loquacity. Yeah, literally, talking too much. A man could legally divorce his wife for gossiping or just arguing with her in-laws. But you guessed it, reality totally bent those rules. The official Confucian ideal wanted women to be passive and stay perfectly homebound. But in practice, it was a totally different world. At the very highest levels of government, empress dowagers, the mothers of the emperors, were frequently the ones pulling the strings, overriding their sons and acting as the true rulers of the entire empire. And down on the streets, women were working as medical physicians, sorcerers, and massive business owners. You had women running huge textile empires with hundreds of employees or dominating the high-end luxury pearl trade. Let's pivot to Section 4, Philosophy, Law, and Education. So how do you actually keep a massive, complex society like this from completely falling apart? Well, it took a really specific mix of brutal, down-to-earth laws and some seriously grand cosmic justification. The anchor for the whole thing was the mandate of heaven. The emperor wasn't just a political boss, he was basically the highest priest on earth. People deeply believed that his personal morality and how well he performed proper rituals literally controlled the balance of nature. If he was good, the crops grew. If he messed up, heaven would send a giant red flag, like a flood, an earthquake, or a swarm of locusts. To actually run things day to day, the Han pulled off this brilliant philosophical mashup. They took the strict, ruthless, punishment-heavy laws from the previous Qin dynasty, which was known as legalism, and they essentially wrapped them up in Taoist ideas of smooth administration. Then, they coded the whole thing in the deeply ethical, family-oriented, and cosmically tied teachings of Confucianism. It was basically an iron fist, totally hidden inside a beautifully embroidered, cosmically ordained silk glove. And that leads us to our final part, Section 5, Religion, Cosmology, and Rebellion. Okay, so if the emperor literally had the mandate of heaven, and society was perfectly balanced by this genius mix of law and philosophy, why did the Han dynasty ultimately crash and burn? Well, it all circles back to that cosmic connection. The Han Chinese viewed the entire universe through the cycles of yin and yang and the 5 phases: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. These cycles dictated absolutely everything, from human medicine to the destiny of the state itself. But this was a massive double-edged sword. When terrible famines and rampant diseases struck the empire in the 2nd century CE, the people didn't just think, oh, bad weather. They felt the emperor's natural balance had totally failed. The mandate was officially slipping. As the central government started getting weaker and, frankly, completely corrupt, these desperate, starving peasants realized they had nowhere to turn. So what did they do? They flocked to massive, grassroots, Taoist religious societies. These incredible, charismatic leaders popped up, claiming that illness was actually caused by personal sin, and it could only be cured by confessing to religious elders and drinking holy water. Almost overnight, they began organizing millions of disenfranchised people, totally outside the view of the state. You can just watch the whole thing rapidly unravel. In 1420 CE, this massive Taoist movement, called the Way of the 5 Pecks of Rice, starts organizing the peasantry. By 166 CE, the political corruption in the capital is so toxic that the educated gentry actually protest. The state's response? Ban them from holding office, literally alienating the exact scholars who are supposed to be running the empire. And then the powder keg finally ignites. In 184 CE, the Yellow Turban Rebellion erupts. Millions of peasants, fueled by a mix of mysticism and sheer starvation, rise up, pushing the mighty Han Empire right to its breaking point. And that leaves us with a pretty profound final thought. The Han Dynasty laid the cultural foundation for thousands of years of Chinese history. But as we've seen throughout this explainer, it didn't last 4 centuries because it was some perfect, unbreakable machine. It survived precisely because of these amazing paradoxes. Because merchants found clever ways to trade, women found ways to lead, and society constantly negotiated the gray area between the myth of perfect order and the messy reality of human life. So I ask you, what rigid systems in our own modern society are actually just being held together by everyday people quietly bending the rules? Think about that and keep exploring.